Welcome to another exciting episode of Deterrence Down Under, a podcast dedicated to Australia and the challenges of deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. Deterrence Down Under is part of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies podcasting network, where we strive to promote peace, foster strategic stability, and help you to think deterrence. Just a friendly reminder that the opinions expressed by our hosts and guests are their own and don't necessarily reflect any institution with which they may be affiliated. G'day from Canberra. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Hello and welcome to Deterrence Down Under, the show that reminds you from Australia to always think deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm Natalie, and in today's episode we will discuss a recent article published in the Global Security Review. It's titled Time to Proliferate Nuclear Weapons or Not, and it's with the authors Dr. Christine Leah and Dr. Peter Layton. Dr. Christine Leah, who you know from our show, is a fellow at the US National Institute for Deterrence Studies and has worked on nuclear issues at Yale, MIT and RAND, and in London, Singapore and Canberra. She's the author of The Consequences of American Nuclear Disarmament and Australia and the Bomb. Dr. Peter Layton has been a previous guest on our show and is a visiting fellow at the Griffith Asia Institute, an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. He is the author of Grand Strategy and co-author of Warfare in the Robotic Age. They're going to share with us their views on whether the US abandon the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and instead force its allies to field nuclear weapons. Thanks so much for joining us, Christine and Peter. All right. So we seem to have lost Christine. So we'll tee off, Peter. You opened the article by stating, a fundamental question is now in play. Should the US abandon the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty it created in the 1960s and instead push its allies to field nuclear weapons? You mentioned structural changes have occurred in the international system. What observations have you made regarding these structural changes that forced you to ask this question?
I think that the biggest one, of course, has been in the last couple of months, and there's been fairly large changes that the Trump administration has introduced, in particular with its relationships with its allies. There are certainly doubts in Europe now about American extended nuclear deterrence, and the trouble is, extended nuclear deterrence is based on trust, and at the same time, everyone's very, very unsure about the reliability of the US administration. They'll certainly, if you like, put America first. The question is whether they will also put other countries up there also. So we have the major issue, I think, is the change in the US. But we have to be fair and say that there's also been major structural changes with Russia being much more boisterous now about using nuclear threats during the Ukraine war, China expanding its nuclear forces drastically, and of course the North Koreans also expanding further and further. So there's been a lot of changes in the nuclear world, and there's a lot of turbulence out there. So the question now is, of course, is that the Americans were the principal both guarantors and, if you like, the pushers of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. So whether that treaty has now reached its use-by date.
Right. Yeah, you make some great points there about the current environment that we face and alliance with the US.
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned some historical examples of countries reconsidering their nuclear stance. Could you run us through the significance of those examples, please?
I think seeing that we're unsure now on what the nuclear stance is in the future, if we look back to the past, to the early days of the nuclear age, and in particular in the 1950s and the early 1960s. When people were trying to think of the correct way about incorporating nuclear weapons into the balance of the power, and there was a proliferation of nuclear weapons sort of towards the early 1960s, where of course the Brits and the French and the Chinese. We also had the introduction of this policy of the nuclear sharing. And of course, during the 50s and the early 60s, was very firm about the early use of nuclear weapons during any Soviet Union invasion of Western Europe. So most of the war plans of the 50s and the 60s tended to assume the use of the nuclear weapons, and fairly large ones, and fairly early. So there's a lot of turbulence there. There was talk, in fact, about basing long-range nuclear weapons across the Pacific, in the Philippines and in Australia. So the time was the time was very unsettled, and there were lots of brand new ideas. I think now, when the time is similarly also unsettled, now's the time to be perhaps thinking about different approaches to nuclear weapons.
Yeah, it's interesting how you say that they would have considered early use of those weapons. I mean, when you read some of the leaked Russian doctrine, they seem to that they would go in early with nuclear weapons in a large-scale war. But obviously in Ukraine, they can't really attack a non-nuclear weapon state with weapons. Well, they're not meant to. So I guess we're seeing a different sort of thing play out there. In your article, you also provide some recommendations for how US allies could reconsider their nuclear stances. Could you walk us through those options?
Well, there's several options here, just as there were during the 50s and the 60s. I mean, the first one, of course, is that they build nuclear weapons by themselves. Now, that's a long-term project for some, at least. It is not just as easy. It's sort of, even if you have a nuclear power plant, you obviously have to enrich the uranium and to go through the whole cycle of design and test and building, etc. That's a fairly long-term plan, but certainly could be done by Germany or South Korea or Japan, relatively straightforward.
Right.
Another alternative in Europe is that the UK or France steps into the lack of a US nuclear deterrence, and they provide extended nuclear deterrence for, say, Poland and Scandinavia, and maybe the rest of the NATO. The problem with that is that the French and the UK nuclear strike systems are designed for a second strike case. So they're principally on the submarines at sea. There's a relatively small number of them, and they're designed for the end of the world kind of the situation. They're not designed for that nuclear warfighting. So you will recall in the Ukraine war in the early days, in towards, I think, about October 2022, what it looked like the Ukrainians might be actually advancing towards the Crimea and breaking through Russian lines. That the US intelligence agencies thought that or discovered that the Russian force commander, the Russian army commander, was seriously considering the use of tactical nuclear at that point to stop a Ukrainian advance. So we've got a couple of situations in there where that wouldn't necessarily fit the case of the UK and the French nuclear forces. And the third option is that the US, if you like, become somewhat more ambitious about being a global leader and step up nuclear sharing. Now, they have nuclear sharing with the more longer established Western European allies, such as Germany, etc., and the Netherlands. But Poland has been asking for nuclear sharing for some time now, but the Americans have been reticent. But perhaps now's the time when there is this uncertainty for the Americans to perhaps advance this particular idea. Now, we've also seen, I suppose, on the other side of the bomb line, that Russia has been effectively nuclear sharing with Belarus. They started that about 12 months ago. The nuclear sharing idea, of course, is now causing trouble, or is now causing concern with China. China and Russia have just released a document getting concerned about nuclear sharing and about the possibility of nuclear proliferation. So it is certainly a case.
Sorry, could you just talk us through that one a little bit more? So when you're saying that they're concerned about nuclear sharing and proliferation, are you talking about that they're concerned about that happening in Asia or in Europe?
I think they're principally they're principally concerned about it becoming the new global standard, if you like.
Right.
The Russians are concerned about countries like Poland or Scandinavia, but the
Mm-hmm.
Chinese are also concerned about South Korea. Of course, there has been a fair bit of talk lately about South Korea, about reintroducing nuclear weapons into South Korea. So there's a possibility there. But bearing in mind that nuclear sharing is a misnomer, it's just the Americans sharing information about nuclear weapons. While perhaps in some cases there are a small number of nuclear weapons located in the countries concerned, and they could be used during a conflict. At least in the initial stages, it is simply setting up the country so they could possibly use them sometime in the future. But it is noticeable that the idea of nuclear sharing now has Russian and Chinese interest.
Yes. And so with the NPT, why do you suggest the president could declare the NPT finished and instead encourage its allies to go nuclear? Is this not against President Trump's will to denuclearize, and where allies could choose instead to abandon the NPT, or are you suggesting it because this is unlikely and that the US may have to force its allies like Australia to reconsider their nuclear stances? Because the more US allies with nuclear weapons against the Asian nuclear axis, that is Russia, China, North Korea and Iran, could potentially make for a more stable world.
Yes, there is the argument there, definitely, that more nuclear weapons make a more stable international system, and there's the counter argument: the nuclear weapons make it much more dangerous. If you like, the chances of a war go down, but if there is a war, it is much more serious. Now, since the start of this year, the new US administration has been relatively cavalier about nuclear weapons and about the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. And there's been a certain stance of, well, others can do as they wish. But it is noticeable that in the last week, during the India-Pakistan standoff, as soon as it seemed to be that nuclear weapons might be being seriously thought about after the Indian attack near our Pakistan headquarters, as soon as that happened, the Americans suddenly got very interested. So I think that there could be a bit of a change of heart in the administration, where they realise that the proliferation of nuclear weapons is not in their interest. The problem now, of course, is they would need to, if you like, reassure allies, because at the moment there's a great deal of uncertainty about what the US stance is. And the trouble is, once you lose trust in an ally, it's hard to get the trust back again. And we're talking about trust with extended nuclear deterrence. We're talking about trust in an extremely difficult crisis situation. Do you trust that the Americans would, if you like, sacrifice Los Angeles for a Tokyo? It's that old, very, very difficult question that nobody wants to answer. I want to introduce something new here now in this of nuclear sharing. We've always been, if you like, looked at the Western European model, where they've shared weapons like say the B-61 nuclear bomb. And these are big weapons with a reasonable number of kilotons, and they really are strategic weapons. Even though people avoid the question of something about what they should be used for, they are really city busting weapons, sort of counter value targets, if you like, rather than necessarily counter force. But times have moved on. Remember that these weapons were originally designed to be so big because the accuracy of the weapon was rather poor. So you took out the aiming errors by simply having a bigger weapon.
Right.
But cruise missiles and ballistic rockets and drones and everything else now are extremely accurate, down to centimetres. So you can deliver a nuclear weapon very accurately indeed now. So the question is now, do we need really big nuclear weapons, or can we go down to, say, a 1 kiloton nuclear weapon and literally have a tactical nuclear weapon for that particular purpose? So if you like, have another methods of signalling in that fire break between conventional weapons and large scale use of thermonuclear weapons. So for sharing, Would it be possible, no, not necessarily to share large nuclear weapons that introduce concerns about the end of the world, but rather one kiloton weapons that are tactical nuclear weapons to stop a nuclear power invading another? Because at the moment we have the problem of imperialism, where the Russians perhaps might walk into the Baltic states, North Korea might attack into South Korea. Things like this, we're concerned about an invasion like that again. So I think perhaps we need to have a bit of think about nuclear sharing in another way of thinking about it, and thinking not necessarily sharing strategic nuclear weapons, but if you like, sharing those rather small ones.
Yes. So I thought you were going to propose that Australia put the B-61 on the F-35s, but they might not go far enough. However, I guess it comes back to what is actually going to deter in the minds of the adversaries, really, at the end of the day, whether or not a small nuclear weapon is going to, or whether or not it's taking out a vital asset is, but you risk that. I mean, conventional's fine, but you just risk the escalation path, so then you do probably need that backstop of nuclear weapons. I guess that's my whole point of conventional may be okay, providing you've got that backstop. And you'll have to pay attention to my article that's coming out titled, it's titled the Slicker Men, the Virginia-class submarines and AUKUS, because I do talk about this idea of nuclear sharing in there.
Okay.
And a dual capable submarine mission instead of a DCA.
Yes, of course, that was another idea that was looked at in the 60s as well, was to have a multilateral force, if you like, a multinational nuclear force. And one of the proposals was to have either surface warships or submarines manned by NATO nations that had nuclear weapons. And on those submarines, perhaps you would just have the Americans or the British or the French actually being in charge to authorize the release of the nuclear weapons, but nonetheless, the nuclear force itself being a multilateral activity. So not just the US, but the close involvement of others. So a more extended form of a nuclear sharing. That kind of, if you like, everyone being involved in a nuclear submarine together, a sort of joint manning of it, and SSBN. That once again indicates there's different ways of thinking about this particular nuclear sharing idea, and different ways where the Americans could, if you like, reassure its allies of its determination. As I said, it's a little bit difficult to know what's happening in Washington at the moment, because there was a fairly cavalier matter about nuclear weapons, but there seems to be a bit of a turn there now, and somewhat more interest. But I think that given Russia and given changes in Russia, given changes in China, I think there needs to be more attention given to reassuring the allies and if you like, providing a few options out there.
Yes, because we know that China's already stated that they're not going to go to the table until the US and Russia go first and decrease their nuclear weapons stockpile, and then Russia has come out saying that the talks would have to now involve Europe in those discussions, given that Europe's come out with this notion to proliferate as well. So those denuclearization talks are probably unlikely to occur.
They are, although I said this latest sort of declaration out of China means that at least has China's attention. So I think it's one of those things that, if you like, talks won't happen unless people push them. And if you like, the Russians over the last few years have sort of made nuclear threats normal. So the normalization of the threat of the nuclear warfare is a bit worrying. So there needs to be some sort of pushback, but a pushback that just suggests that if you don't come on board, there is a virtual punishment for it, sort of, if you like, that you will end up worse off. So I think you have to if you like, to use that term, incentivize. You have to give the Russians and the Chinese a reason to engage in arms control talks.
Yes, but hopefully not at the expense of allies like Australia, because I mean the Russian ambassador to Indonesia had complaints or grievances over AUKUS, and the basing of weapons in Australia as well, and the submarines. So hopefully not at the expense of Australia's reliance upon US extended nuclear deterrence as well.
That is right, and that's a great example of the fact that the Russians these days appear to just hand out nuclear threats sort of willy-nilly, if you like. So they've gone with the difficulties having with their conventional force in Europe. They have really stressed nuclear weapons more and more, and they become very cavalier also about making nuclear threats. This is almost a return back to the early 1960s, and Khrushchev thumping his shoe at the United Nations business. So I think there is probably a way through the Chinese to constrain the Russians. The Chinese are clearly being concerned about the possible use of nuclear weapons. So perhaps there's a way of introducing arms control through China restraining Russia.
Right, yeah, they were definitely concerned there when I think Xi Jinping had the conversation with German Schultz over his concerns about nuclear weapon use in Ukraine. So we do have that one data point on that, that Xi Jinping didn't want a nuclear war in his backyard. And but they do also have the risk. I mean, there is the risk of the Russian and Chinese contingency over Siberia as well. So that's why they also won't readily give up their nuclear weapons.
So I think at the present time with the nuclear weapons, a big concern at the moment is with the Ukraine war, the Russians have been able to constrain Western aid to the Ukrainians and get the US and the Europeans to pressure Ukraine not into perhaps using Western weapons into Russia. So if you like, the Russians have created a sanctuary for themselves. The Ukrainians have been using some drones, but their drones carrying very small warheads. So while they're a problem, they aren't much a problem. So Russia with its nuclear weapons has created a sanctuary inside Russia. So there are concerns that if Russia moved on from the Ukraine to the Baltic, they would also, if you like, be able to invade the Baltic, but have a Russian sanctuary where Russia could just keep on building up arms and just and to keep up the war. Russia doesn't have an incentive at the moment to stop the war. Now, if we bring that out into Asia, then there's that issue about North Korea. North Korea might attack South Korea and have a sanctuary once more with the threat of the nuclear weapons. So there is this problem now that the Russian invasion of the Ukraine has normalised a nuclear weapon state threatening nuclear weapons to stop itself being attacked and to make sure it can just keep the war going on an indefinite basis. There has to be some way there of handling a nuclear power that is so loose about nuclear threats.
Well, I guess that comes back down to strategy and the ends, ways and means, and how do you get to those ends that you want, and what exactly do those ends look like?
Indeed.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, Peter. It's been a great discussion. It's a bit of a pity that we lost Christine in the process. And always remember to think deterrence.
Thank you for listening to Deterrence Down Under. Please take a minute to review the podcast, as your reviews help our podcast reach more listeners and expand the debate about strategic issues facing Australia and the region. Our show is made possible by the NIDS Podcasting Network, a division of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. NIDS is a U.S.-based 501c3 organization that relies upon donations to produce this podcast and spread awareness of the peacekeeping value of U.S. strength, alliances, and deterrence. You can find a wide range of NIDS podcasts at thinkdeterrence.com. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to send us an email at ddu@thinkdeterrence.com. I would like to thank our producer, Kimberly Charrington, and our sponsors, and all the amazing members of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies for making this podcast possible.